Hey everybody, welcome to the Muckrake Podcast. I'm Yates, Sexton. I'm here with Nick Hauselman. Nick, how you doing, man?
I'm okay, just trying to get along and make it through the day.
You're growing a beard for anybody who wants to
Am
watch
I?
on YouTube. Yeah, you've got a beard type situation going
I
on.
am. I mean, I didn't shave it, so I guess I am. I don't know. Why not?
I like
It's
it
been
when
a
you
long
grow a
time.
little bit of a beard.
I used to have beards all the time, and then I don't know. Maybe some gray started popping up, and I was like, "Yeah, I'm not gonna do it." But you know what? I'm letting the gray out and see what
As
happens.
somebody who embraces the gray beard, I'm inviting you along on this journey.
Yeah, let's see what happens. You never know. It's the mystery of life.
It's the mystery of life. People, we got a lot of stuff to cover today. Actually, from around the world, we're going to look at the EU elections as well as what's going on in Israel. We also are going to have on the show Teddy Wilson, an extremism researcher. He publishes at Radical Reports on Substack. He has a new podcast called Insurrectionist Cookbook, highly recommended. We're going to talk to Teddy about the extremism situation in America here in just a second. Before we get to the news of the day, Nick, a reminder for people to go to patreon.com/muckrakepodcast, subscribe, support the show, keep us ad-free, editorially independent. On top of that, when you do that, not only do you get to come hang out with us for exclusive post-event analysis for things like the upcoming presidential debate and major events, but things like this Thursday, or at 8 p.m. Eastern, this coming Thursday, June 13th, we are going to have a live show where our patrons will be able to join us. They'll be able to watch the Weekender getting recorded on Friday, which is the subscriber-only show. They get to ask us questions. I always look forward to these things. I know you do as well, Nick.
Oh, absolutely. It's always a great time. And please come on over. It's you really would enjoy it. And we opened up our a couple weeks ago for our full show of a live show, what it sounds like. And you'll get it, you'll get more of that stuff. It's really great. So
People had a great time. I mean, it's not every day that a former president gets convicted of a felony, and we get to go live and talk about it and, look at the fallout. That is patreon.com/muckrakepodcast. Before we get to Teddy, before we get to our interview about extremism in America, Nick, we gotta venture around the world. We're globetrotters today. Over in the where the history comes from, Europe. The European Union elections were held, and the results were mixed. I'll say that. It was a little bit tough. The center-right European People's Party maintained control over the EU, but there were massive, massive gains made by the far right in both France and Germany and other locales, especially in France. Marine Le Pen's national rally, which for people who don't necessarily keep track of these things, we've talked about on the show previously, Nick, this is a group of people who are not only far right, they're not only white supremacist, they're not only authoritarian, but they have roots that can be traced back into proto-fascism. For anybody at home who doesn't understand that, that means before fascism finally came around, National Rally's roots were firmly entrenched in the same type of authoritarian ideas. They had an incredible showing in the EU elections. It looks like Le Pen has an opportunity to be the future president of France as well. Emmanuel Macron, the current president of France, reacted to the disappointing results by calling for a snap election. He dissolved parliament and said later on in this summer, then that's going to be June 30th. So just around the corner, there are going to be snap elections for parliament, which could lead to a whole hell of a lot of weird results. I'm going to go ahead and give you some analysis, Nick. I find this troubling.
That's some interesting analysis. I guess I'm trying to figure out what Macron is trying to get at here, because in theory, like, remember when Britain voted to exit for Brexit, and then
and everyone's like, oh, don't worry about it, everything's fine. Please don't worry about calling this vote. Yeah.
Right. And then, a few weeks later, a lot of people kind of didn't even understand what they had been voting for. There's a lot of
what year
regret.
was that? Did that portend anything that happened a couple of months later?
We don't have to get back into that.
Oh, we don't have to talk about 2016 anymore. We're just going to pretend that didn't happen.
Yeah, it's the wrong timeline. So it's possible that he's thinking there will be some, sort of not by remorse, but maybe literally the shock of oh no, we are under attack by this incredible, crazy right-wing stuff. Let's get everyone rallied for a quick vote and put this thing down. But the timing is tough because it's happening very quickly. And there is a big push, and it seems to me that it's all rooted in anti-immigration. Is that safe to say?
Well, it's anti-immigration, xenophobic sort of energies, rising right-wing authoritarianism, which is something that we unfortunately always have to tell people about. There's a couple of things that are happening. First of all, this is a gamble. The idea of going ahead and holding snap elections, if this doesn't happen, and for people who don't know this, Macron's term, the next full election is supposed to be in 2027, which according to my math is 3 years from now. The idea, I think, is that if this isn't done, there will be the specter of national rally that will be like sort of hanging over his presidency and his term as well. I think he looks at a couple of things that are just like coming up. Of course, we have the Olympics that are going to take place in Paris. And by the way, like if that's part of the gamble, there are major rumors and fears of terrorism taking place at this year's Olympics, which probably could help, national rally, possibly win some votes. We could be looking at a circumstance where National Rally could gain popular support in France in these elections. You would have Emmanuel Macron as president, and you could have Jordan Bardella, who is this 28-year-old phenom within the National Rally, who is incredibly scary. He's already being positioned as the future far right ruler of France. This is a guy who doesn't even shy away from white replacement theory as one of his major ideological narratives. The possibility is that he could become the prime minister of France. So you could have theoretically a divided government in France between Emmanuel Macron, who is not only a neoliberal but has moved further and further to the right, a center right president, the far right National Rally. Which part of the analysis I wanted to talk about before we moved on from this, Nick, is that centrists like Macron are becoming more and more comfortable working with the far right. So yes, we could have a divided government, but we could also have a France that is going along with the trajectory of what you and I have been talking about, which is the beginning of a right-wing momentum that is starting to influence not just politics, but to bring the center further and further right.
Yeah, and again, I got not belabor the point necessarily of immigration into other people's countries because we're dealing with it here as well. It's a very intoxicating argument, right? You can prey on people's fears, how people are just pouring into our country, they're changing the culture, all these different things, and you can get someone who is not connected to politics to get behind something like that, right? And oh, I don't want that in my neighborhood. I don't want that, and that's what's concerning. I kind of actually did a little bit of research to figure out in Europe where are a lot of immigrants coming from that is causing so much of this hand wringing. And it was interesting because it seems like Syria is the number one place, and then Afghanistan's also not.
That's so weird that Syria and Afghanistan would be supplying a bunch of immigrants. I don't know of anything that Western democracies have done to increase immigrants from Syria or Afghanistan. That's weird.
Yeah, well, or Syria itself and the leadership there. What have they done to lead to an exodus that people need to leave from there as well, right? Like that's the other issue.
Mm.
And so, I guess I'm always looking at this as like, what is the solution? What are you supposed to do to try and tamp this down? We're going to talk a little bit about this with our guests in terms of, right wing extremism. But I'm not exactly sure, because again, if you wanted to address the notion of people immigrating to your country, I suppose we're supposed to welcome that and be able to maximize that as a cultural thing anyway. And instead, it's becoming this lightning rod that has led to extremism on the other side. You know what I mean?
Well, the truth is that immigration is sort of the false thing that we're talking about. The problem isn't immigration. Like when you actually take a look at cosmopolitan liberalism, like you're supposed to have quote unquote melting pots. We're supposed to bring people in, we're supposed to become a larger society, change and evolve, progress, all of that. That's not the issue. The issue is that in an age of austerity, where people feel more and more like they can't get ahead, they can't afford homes, their work is constantly becoming more and more exploited. By the way, in the background of all this, not just in France, but in the United States, that social safety net is being absolutely shredded, right? The line between you living a life and you falling into abject poverty and falling behind is getting smaller and smaller and eventually destroyed. As a result, what happens? White supremacy and chauvinism, they grow. Well, okay, so can we have a society where we're all living and sort of striving and changing? Or is it group versus group versus group? And
Mhm.
in France, for instance, you have a lot of the social safety net that's going away. Emmanuel Macron has like spent most of his tenure getting rid of that social safety net and sort of the the programs in France that are supposed to make people feel more and more comfortable, which is what happens with neoliberal globalism. And so as a result, immigration becomes the cause celebre, right? It becomes the thing where all of a sudden it's like, oh, it's dog eat dog already. We don't need more people coming in. We need to get rid of them. And you see that white supremacy starting to come out, which is why you have right wing authoritarianism not just growing around the world. France, the United States, we're looking at Germany, we're looking at Great Britain, all these Western democracies. But what you're actually watching is that the focus is that the terms of the competition that we're talking about, these elections, it changes. Instead of talking about making the world better for people, you're talking about who deserves what scraps are remaining. So
Mhm.
it's sort of a false question that unfortunately it's where national rally they prevail. It's where the Republican Party prevails. We even see in America now where liberals are like, oh man, immigration really needs to be shut down and maybe we need to close the border. Like you're starting to see this becoming a bipartisan push because you're not actually addressing the conditions that are leading to the supposed problem in the first place.
Well, I also wonder if this is also a an incumbency problem, whereas
Oh,
whoever
absolutely.
if you're a sitting duck if you're already in power and you're just right to be criticized to no end for and without much recourse. And the problem with that is that it seems like if a authoritarian comes into power in that manner, um, they become the incumbent, but it takes longer for that spell to wear off. You might end up being 15 years worth of authoritarianism before you can maybe finally get to move on to something else, which we've seen. But that's a huge chunk of a lot of people's lives to have to deal with that until it's over.
Well, if you ever get on the other side of it. I mean, it's one of those
Mhm.
things, and, actually, we talked to Teddy Wilson a little bit about this in the interview later. He was talking about how a lot of right-wing extremists saw Trump saying, "I fixed the border problem, I built the wall," and they're like, "No, you didn't take care of this." For a lot of people, though, Trump saying, "I built the wall, I took care of immigration," and by the way, you have these scenes of, like, brutality of, like, children in camps and cages. That makes people feel like the problem's being taken care of. But when you like you said, the incumbency problem, I mean, Joe Biden could not be reached for comment on this. This is not a good time to be in charge because none of the powers that be are particularly interested in solving this. They're going to continue to do some of these right-wing things, whether it's executive actions on immigration or all I mean, Macron is shameless in this stuff. And I guarantee you, if National Rally wins, he is going to be more than happy to work with them in this government. We're going to talk about Netanyahu in a second. He's the same way. He was more than happy to reach across to the far right and make common cause with them. So yeah, it ends up in a place where authoritarians say, listen, everything is absolutely screwed up, give us full power. And then they create the fantasy that things are being taken care of. They don't actually take care of things, but it
Right.
feels good because your enemies are upset and because you're getting sort of that cathartic feeling of the clash of civilizations, which is what they base their appeal on in the first place. Speaking of clashes of cultures, in Israel, we have a whole lot of stuff going on. We had a raid just the other day that freed 4 hostages. I would be remiss if I didn't point out that it killed over 200 people and injured maybe 600 more. But in the wake of that, Benny Gantz, who was a part of Israel's war cabinet and is one of Netanyahu's chief rivals and maybe one of the few people who could defeat him in an election, he resigned. He labeled Benjamin Netanyahu as a hindrance to peace and said that Israel cannot possibly win its war with him at the helm. He has now called for Netanyahu to set elections in the fall. This is kind of a pretty big deal. And based on the politics that are taking place in Israel and also the ongoing sort of churn of death and destruction taking place in Gaza, it's not clear whether or not Gantz's resignation or challenge of Netanyahu is going to push things into the next level. But it certainly feels like things are beginning to move a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. This is the beginning of something, and how long it might take, we have no idea, but it's
We have
something.
no idea.
I mean, even if you want to take the numbers you're reporting, cut those in half. Let's just say that they're not exactly accurate. It's still preposterous to think that that many people would suffer for 4 hostages, even though obviously the people in those families of the hostages would are as happy as can be to have their family members back home. So I wonder if this is almost like, it's becoming more of a problem in terms of tactics. And we've said this before. It's like, the indiscriminate killing of innocent people, no matter what the ratios are from enemy combatants to innocent people. It's just where no one has confidence that they're doing this competently, and there are better ways to do this. And obviously the fear that the rest of the hostages would just get killed at this point is high, because at this point, like, what else are the Hamas going to do with their hostages if they're going to be under fire like this? And I guess we have to, is this time to talk about what the negotiations are really just about at this point, and why they can't get a ceasefire? I mean, it sounds like it's really just about, they want to give the hostages back, but they want a permanent ceasefire, and Israel does not want to do a permanent ceasefire. I also have a feeling Israel wants no part of a deal that has Hamas still in power in Gaza. And to me, that would be the one thing that I think a lot of people in the world would at least be able to agree to, is that Hamas shouldn't be in power in Gaza anymore. But I'm not so sure anymore that would even be a compelling argument for a lot of people.
Well, I want to go ahead and replace Israel with Netanyahu and the people around him, because, I think a lot of Israelis are wanting this thing to come to an end. They want permanent peace. They want to live in peace. Meanwhile, Netanyahu, going back into divided governments, the only reason he's in power is because he formed a coalition back in May of 2022 with the far right in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not necessarily that they want new leadership in Gaza. They don't want Palestinians in Gaza. Like the far right, if you listen to them, you look at what they say, you look at their entire political positions, like they embrace aggressive settler colonialism, as well as a project that more or less clears this thing out and wants ethnic cleansing. I mean, it depends on the person, it depends on the time of day you talk to them, but a lot of them are very open about this. Add on top of that the fact that Netanyahu, and we've talked about this on the show, Nick, if he's not in power, he could very well go to jail. Like, he doesn't want this to end. He doesn't want this to go away. So the question here is whether or not, first of all, he will call for elections. And by the way, going back to the Macron thing and now the Netanyahu thing, maybe it's not a good idea to have governments that call for elections. Maybe it'd be a good idea to have a system where, like, oh, we're going to have an election now, and that's how this stuff's going to go. Maybe we're past that, because now we're looking at, Netanyahu would literally have to make a decision that would put his political and legal jeopardy, and like his legal, life in jeopardy. Like, he has to make a decision, but his entire basis of this coalition government is to work with the people who want that. It's not about fighting a smart war. They're doing what they want to do. You know what I mean? Like, a lot of these people, they want to go ahead and quote unquote finish the job, and finish them off, to borrow Nikki Haley's parlance. But like, you can't look at this from a rational standpoint of like, why would they not want these deals? Why would they not want this to happen? And then you have to wonder, is Gantz the one person who can put together something of a push or momentum to put more pressure on Netanyahu? And we don't know. We're not really sure if that can happen. We've known that Gantz was going to leave for a while. He has been signaling and telling everybody who would listen. But on top of that, and Nick, this is something we have to talk about, Netanyahu, despite consistently flipping off the United States of America and Joe Biden and rubbing their face in the dirt, he basically rules right now with the okay of the U.S. administration, right? Like, the fact that they haven't pushed back, they haven't taken things away from him, that might make the difference of lever. Meanwhile, he's set to come to America on July 24th, address a joint session of Congress. And what's he want? He wants to come in, influence American politics. And who's he want to be president, Nick?
Trump, his buddy.
He absolutely wants Donald Trump to be president. And authoritarians like Netanyahu, they want Trump to be president. So what we have now is a situation where we do have a rival in Gantz who could possibly gain some popularity and momentum and take power away from Netanyahu. But Netanyahu is holding on to this thing for dear life.
Well, if you understand, like, even like with the Russian influence and what the goal of Russia is in terms of creating chaos here politically, then it makes perfect sense that Netanyahu was going to play by that same playbook and want to come and speak. And that's exactly why Mike Johnson invited him. Okay, so I understand that Mike Johnson is a Republican, and they need to sow chaos with a Democrat in the White House. But why in the fuck is Chuck Schumer signing off on the invitation to Netanyahu as well? And that makes no sense to me. There are going to probably be Democrats who boycott this speech, But for the life of me, I have to imagine Chuck Schumer must be thinking he's playing some weird version of chess where he's going to sit down with Netanyahu when he's in America and then convince him to somehow agree to a ceasefire. And we've already heard Schumer criticize him, pretty strongly. So and by the way, that whole thing isn't going to happen. Schumer is not going to be able to talk to Netanyahu, and then Netanyahu's going to hit his head and be like, "Oh, Chuck, gosh, you're so right. I can't believe I didn't think of that." So he's going to end up being steamrolled too. It's going to be ugly, and I really, it's just they're playing right into the hands. It's unfathomable how they're allowing this to happen.
Yeah, it's first of all, it's a smattering of congressional Democrats who have absolutely no sway whatsoever on the party. I think what we're looking at, and this is unfortunate, Nick. I really hate this. Like there was the moment where Chuck Schumer started saying, there need to be elections in Israel and maybe new leadership is necessary. Meanwhile, what are we seeing from prominent Democrats? We're seeing them continue to support Israel in their actions in Gaza. And I think what we're basically looking at going into November as a party decision is that the party is going to rally around Israel. They're not going to criticize it very much. And basically, we're going to have two parties in the country. One party is going to say we have to support Israel, continue selling them weapons and supporting this action in Gaza. And the other party is saying, you're not supporting them enough. We need to go all the way. We need to carry this thing out, which again, it's not a coincidence. You brought up Russia. We just talked about what's happening in Europe. We're now talking about what is happening in Israel. This right-wing movement around the world, they're on the same page. They're all interested in one thing, which is increasing the chaos and violence and, for the record, white supremacy that we've talked about so far. And we're also going to talk with Teddy Wilson about here in just a minute. It is a project that has the same notes and denotations, which is why not only did Mike Johnson invite Netanyahu to Congress, but why the Republicans going into November are going to go after the Democrats for not being supportive enough for Israel, even though they have been the party that has supplied the weapons and continually supported them. So it's only going to lead to more and more escalation and more and more escalating rhetoric while it goes.
Yeah, and the Democrats can kiss goodbye to a huge chunk of the 18 to 25-year-old vote.
And possibly Michigan, Wisconsin, or Georgia. Yeah,
right, exactly. And all their hope is that it's not in those states, but it probably will be because there's universities there and a lot of college students. But talking to a bunch of them recently in and around my house, it's like none of them are going to vote for Trump. This is not a binary thing. But they're simply not going to get any support from a huge chunk of that. And then it becomes a thing of how important is that demographic? Generally, it is on a close election. And I don't think it mattered. And I remember I had been saying, well, maybe before the election at some point, they're going to be able to get a ceasefire down. And, hopefully Biden will get credit for forcing Netanyahu to do that. But you had felt like it wouldn't matter now. It's just, at this point, it's too late. And I think I agree with you at this point. It doesn't sound like the cat's out of the bag on that one, or in the bag, and they're not going to change their tune.
You brought up the incumbent problem, and whoever was going to be president as this thing happened let's be frank about it. If Donald Trump were president during, what has happened in Gaza, liberals would be lining up after him, getting after his ass. It would be completely reversed, which I think is actually very telling about our political culture, but that's neither here nor there. Joe Biden has been dealt a lot of bad cards and has played those cards terribly. I don't know how else to say it. And I think, unfortunately, we're in agreement about what that's going to look like going into November, whether or not the damage is already being done. But the last thing that we need, Nick, is Netanyahu coming here in the summer, in the midst of this thing. It's not going to be over. I can't imagine there's going to be a ceasefire at this point, and or anything even approaching a future for Gaza. Gantz, for his credit, he cited the fact that there is no plan. There just isn't, because the only plan is to continue this war and continue the brutality. Netanyahu has no other political or legal choices really to make here. The only thing would be sort of a really, I guess, courageous stand against him that says we need new leadership, we need new elections, which I was a tiny bit hopeful whenever Chuck Schumer called for that. But I haven't seen anything move that direction. And this address and this visit, it just feels bad. I don't know how else to put it.
You have to be a little bit careful about calling for some sort of war plan that has a beginning, middle, and end, because if Smotrich and those guys have any sway, the plan will be what you described. They'll just level Gaza and nothing will be left of it, right? So that is what's really troubling on that end if they're the ones who end up prevailing and getting their way. And then West Bank would probably be next because they've already allowed it to be the Wild West. And you could argue that that Palestinians in the West Bank get worse treatment than Gaza.
Well, and by the way, you bring up the West Bank, and that is sort of it's downstream and of what's going on with this political coalition. It's this settler mentality that is about getting violent with it. And what's the far right in Israel want? They want more of that.
Yeah.
And for the record, we were talking a little bit about Macron and France and this fear of terrorism. People need to start to understand extremism with terrorism and the far right. They work together. It doesn't mean they're on like Zoom calls, but each one of them relies on each other. I mean, if you need evidence of that, go back to 2001, go back to George W. Bush and the neoconservatives and Al Qaeda. Like they helped each other politically. George Bush gained power, and Al Qaeda got a lot of its political objectives simply because they knew what the neoconservatives and the far right were going to do. Netanyahu has not only like relied on Hamas for his political survival, he's helped them. I mean, like, yeah, and that's not a conspiracy theory. He's literally helped them. He doesn't want a post-Hamas Gaza because he needs to either have them in power in order to keep power, or he needs to get rid of them in order to realize his political, operations and agenda the way that he wants it. So it can't be something that gives us a ceasefire that is conducive or constructive. It's basically destructive in any way, which is what he relies on. And for the record, it's what the far right relies on.
Yeah, just to maybe flesh it out a little bit more, the notion that Netanyahu helped Hamas would have been, well, here's all this money we want you to give to the Gazans and help them in infrastructure, for instance, because you're going to use this for that, right? Sure, here you go. Here comes, and so that was sort of like the main thrust of a lot of that help. But certainly Netanyahu never really had any sense of holding them accountable for actually using the money the way it was supposed to be used. And that was probably what he didn't mind at that point. Right. So that was, it's all, he just needs to go, and but again, there's an old adage, never root for a new king, because the next guy could be, the next guy worse. But they got to find someone who can actually have a humanitarian version of this and get them out of this situation. And then, I will pray that Hamas is no longer in power. I think that they've forfeited that right to be there.
No, it'd be a better world if Hamas wasn't in power. And I'm glad that you brought this up. I in no way, shape, or form believe that Benny Gantz would be like some kind of huge upgrade over Netanyahu. Like somehow or another, he's, Mahatma Gandhi ready to take over the reins, right? Like he's part of the same sort of project. But the point is Netanyahu, again, and not that Americans can, take any lessons from this, you don't want someone in power who's facing legal ramifications, and the only way for them to survive is to hold on to power at all cost. I don't know if Gantz is necessarily the answer. On top of that, Nick, one thing that we learn looking at history, militarized culture, the way that Israel is right now, who do they end up having as leaders? Military leaders. They end up having people who want to use the military in sort of a muscular and sort of aggressive stance. So I think you're right. Like wishing for a new king will only get you so far. There needs to be something else that takes place. There needs to be leadership that takes place outside of Israel that works within parts of Israel that don't want this. And right now, there's no clear view of how that happens. It's a quagmire, the likes of which I don't know that we've ever seen before. On that note, we're now going to talk with Teddy Wilson, the author of Radical Reports and the podcast Insurrectionist Cookbook. We'll be back in just a second. All right, everybody, as promised, we have actual friend of the pod. We say that sarcastically all the time, but listen, Teddy Wilson is an actual friend of the pod. And for those who don't know already, he is a researcher of the extreme right. He writes at Radical Reports, and his new podcast is called The Insurrectionist Cookbook. It's an immediate follow for me. Excellent stuff. Teddy Wilson, welcome back to the Muckrake Podcast.
Hey, y'all. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to get to be on the show again.
Teddy, I wish that we could have you on here and basically this could be a follow up where we're like, hey, guess what? The extreme right is done. We don't really have a threat anymore. Things are great. How are things with you? How's life? All of that good stuff. Unfortunately, we are living in an escalating crisis. We are watching the extreme right, as we've talked about earlier in the show, not only start to gain sort of acceptance in political circles, but also to continue to buttress themselves in paramilitaries and groups, and just the threat continues to grow. Can you start us off, Teddy, and tell us in your research and what you've been looking at, where are we with this current problem?
Right. Well, it's a busy time to say the least. I think we, or at least what I've been tracking over the past several weeks, include several things, including the far right's reaction to the conviction of former President Donald Trump and his upcoming sentencing hearing in July. And there was quite the reaction from various corners of the far right. And I will say that one silver lining from that reaction is that we haven't seen any real types of what I would call to action or any types of planning and logistics related to the reaction from the far right since Trump's conviction. There hasn't been any wide scale plans for protest or any other actions as of yet. Now that, of course, can change over time, especially as we get closer to the January 11th sentencing hearing. Um, but that is one piece of what I'm monitoring. Another piece of what I've been monitoring is the far right in various anti-LGBT actors' response and their targeting of pride in various pride events around the country. As I'm sure your listeners know, Pride began on June 1st and goes throughout the rest of the month. And um, again, another silver lining we haven't seen as of yet, although this again might be changing as I speak. We haven't seen the kind of widespread kind of extremist violent actions that we saw last year. Now, this may change as the month goes on. And of course, as I say this past weekend, there was two um, drag show events that were forced to be canceled because of bomb threats in Texas and New York. Um, we had various far right actors specifically target locations around the country because they were holding Pride, including the Christian nationalist Fute, who and I probably pronounced his name wrong, but I don't care. Who held a huge rally in Sacramento, California, this past weekend, and then we saw the neo-Nazi white supremacist group Blood Tribe hold a rally at the Capitol in South Dakota. So there's been quite a bit of action and surrounding Pride. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the coming weeks and months, especially in regards to kind of how the far right reacts to the sentencing of Trump. And as we move further into the presidential election cycle. So I think one of the things, and I'm sure we'll talk about it in more detail, but one of the things from my podcast that examines the January 6th insurrection that I think many experts that I've talked to have highlighted is just how long those seeds were sown leading up to the presidential election and after the election leading into January 6th. I think one of the first times that the Trump campaign and spokespeople for the Trump campaign started mentioning the idea that the election would be stolen or rigged or what have you was in February of 2020. And so I think we should look at these activities of the far right as part of a continuum as we head into the presidential election. So that's the kind of long and short of what's been on my radar over the last couple weeks and months.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how activated or how motivated the far right. And it's hard to use the far right as a general term like this, but are they activated and motivated to get to the ballot box and actually vote and have an effect on the election in November?
Well, that depends on which part of the far right you're talking about. I think if you're talking about, um, maybe one way to describe them is the partisan far right, the people that are, um, kind of actively engaged within Republican and right wing partisan politics. I think they are highly motivated to vote and to participate and get out the vote campaigns and to seek to ensure that, Trump gets a second term. I think the picture is a little murkier when you talk about other areas of the far right, whether you're talking about kind of anti-immigrant extremist groups or even white nationalist groups. Not all of those areas of the far right have been very pleased with, the former president as far as the policy achievements he made or that didn't make, or, even with the tone of his rhetoric, they don't believe it went far enough. I think one example of that is, um, every time you see a video clip or any mention by Trump of his quote unquote success of building the wall, you will, always see people on the far right complain about that and say that he's lying to us and that he didn't actually build the wall. So there is some discontent within the far right when it comes to Trump. So I think it just remains to be seen. I think there's just, um, so many different elements at play, especially kind of thinking about this now. We're in June, and what is kind of animating the right wing media and kind of various parts of the conservative electorate, will likely look very different come October and November. So yeah, I think it's complicated. But I mean, all that saying, I would suspect that you would see, as we get close to the election in November, I think you will start to see even those that, are not particularly fans of the former president kind of get on board with getting him elected for a second term.
Teddy, you brought up not just Trump's sentencing, but January 6th. And one of the things that I've noticed in my research, and I talked about this immediately after Trump's conviction, I was going to, my guess is a lot of the same places where you're going in order to sort of watch these people, research them, sort of lurk and see what they're talking about. It I noticed that a lot of them were saying that they were not necessarily planning on committing violence themselves, but they expected that the soil was already fertile for either Trump supporters to go ahead and do it or to see what happens in November. I think a lot of people have come to see Trump, like you said, it you can't paint it with too broad of a stroke. A lot of these far right people, they see Trump as sort of the embodiment of their dreams, and hopefully a second term will be able to see the authoritarian energies that they're interested in. Others see him as sort of a catalyst. They think he doesn't even go far enough, and that the system is fundamentally broken. I think we're in an incubation period right now where we're watching not just Trump's legal perils sort of come into full view, and I think so many Americans are sort of so they sort of have their doubts about whether or not he's going to be held accountable for his crimes anyway, and that even him going to jail could be very, very useful. And in a lot of other people who are waiting to see what happens in November and what that could possibly lead to. Does it feel like an incubation period for you?
I think that seems like a accurate way to describe it. I think that the idea that we're kind of in an incubation period is seems like the right analysis. I think when you look at the rhetoric in various kind of far right extremist spaces online, I think you do see that there is a tendency for those folks to almost view political violence or even the idea of a quote unquote kind of civil war as a foregone conclusion. And so at this point, it's almost as though there are a lot of folks within that kind of broad spectrum of the far right that are almost just waiting for a match to strike, um, or waiting for, you know, some other inciting incident to push them out and push them forward. And I think it could also be, I think, as I said, we'll probably get into this even more when I talk more about the podcast. But I think one of the other kind of elements that I've come to kind of discern is, um, whether or not something like January 6th could happen again. I think it's useful to think about whether or not something like January 6th could happen again at a more localized level.
Mhm.
I think where we look at the amount of threats that are directed towards election officials, from, you know, everyone from secretaries of state that administer the elections in states, all the way down to county clerks that handle the day to day of the process of voting. I think there's just been a extraordinary volume of threats against people that um, do the work of making elections uh, or run smoothly. So I think that I am one of the things I'm most concerned about is kind of the possibility of extremist violence targeted at whether it's local elections or even something like school boards or even state legislatures and state capitals. And we have seen things like that happen before. We've seen far right extremists attempt to take over state capitals in places like Michigan and Oregon. And so I think it's useful to think about how this might play out on local levels, especially as we head into the election.
Well, don't you think that that kind of focus is a lot more inviting to far right extremists than, for instance, like the Capitol on the day they want to count the votes? Because in my mind, now that it's already happened once, I don't think it would be able to be happen again, because it seems to me that the powers that be would just end up having so much security and support at that point with law enforcement, right? That wouldn't that kind of scare away a lot of the principals who would want to create havoc?
I think that's right. I also think one of the reasons I think that is less likely is how these far right extremist groups have changed their strategies and tactics around organizing. I think so. When you look at a group like the Proud Boys or even the Oath Keepers, you know how many of members of those organizations have been arrested and sentenced to prison for their actions um, in and around January 6th. And what we've seen within those groups, those types of groups, is a strategic kind of decentralization of leadership. There is no more kind of national organization of the Proud Boys. It is gone. It is now very localized, is very decentralized. A group like the Oath Keepers, which was heavily structured towards national leadership, basically doesn't exist anymore. There's a few chapters in a few different places around the country, several of whom have kind of renamed themselves and rebranded themselves. But I think one of the impediments to kind of a big national kind of action or an action on kind of the capital would be that kind of lack of national kind of coordination across multiple groups. So that also makes it more likely that you'd see kind of a more localized action, in part um, because these groups are much more decentralized. They're also can be very different in the way that they function and the kind of tactics and how extremist and violent they can be. Again, with the group like the Proud Boys, kind of the chapters in Ohio look much different than the chapters in South Texas. The ones chapters in Ohio, they do attend public demonstrations. but they are much less prone to extremist violence as are the ones in South Texas, who have a much longer history of actually trying to physically attack people and engage in kind of this street level extremist violence.
So far we've talked about some of these paramilitaries and sort of the far right organizations. And, I think it's important to take a look at them, but also to take a look at the extremism that has been more widespread culturally. And, one of the things that Nick and I have covered on this show is that you have more and more right wing influencers, commentariats, like personalities who are now saying the authoritarian things out loud in a way that they've only sort of hinted at before. I think you used to see a lot of posts, you used to see a lot of things about using the power of the presidency or state power in order to, persecute, prosecute, and execute enemies. Recently, we had a clip, of course, from Tim Pool and Laura Loomer. And we covered that, but we also need to make sure that people understand that this isn't new. I mean, Charlie Kirk and his gaggle of assholes that he keeps around himself were just basically fantasizing about public executions and trials as a way of sort of reinvigorating, I don't know, national spirit or law and order. Can you talk a little bit about how this extremism is spreading more culturally and politically, as opposed to sort of these small pockets of groups and some of these bad actors?
Right. Well, recently, actually, I wrote on my newsletter highlighting within the past 5 or 6 years about a dozen examples of either right wing social media influencers, various far right commentators, even Republican politicians explicitly calling for the death penalty or the execution of their political opponents. And so I think um, there has been a mainstreaming of this kind of not just extremism, but violent extremism. And I think one of the places that you can see um, kind of how that has seeped into the mainstream is also when you see clips like Laura Loomer calling for the execution of Democrats go viral. If you go and look at the replies or the comments on where those videos are posted, whether they're on Twitter or Telegram or Facebook or what have you, I think one of the astonishing things is the amount of people that you see essentially agreeing with what these people are saying and endorsing this kind of political violence. You don't see as many people in those far right spaces saying essentially, you know, let's tone it down a little bit. We don't actually want to do this, do we? You don't really see a lot of that. And the ones that do say those kind of things are quickly shouted down by most of the people within those kind of comments within that community. So I think, yeah, I mean, there's a many ways in which I think the far right and various extremist ideas have been accepted into the mainstream. I mean, I don't necessarily want to keep talking about them, but I think they're kind of a good example of all this is the Proud Boys. The amount of members of the Proud Boys of various chapters around the country that have associated with local Republican parties or other right-wing activists like Moms for Liberty is pretty astonishing. I mean, there's a acceptance of these groups within just mainstream Republican Party politics.
I just wanted to follow up on that very quickly because when we talk about Proud Boys or we talk about Oath Keepers or we talk about paramilitary groups, I think unfortunately we have some stereotypes in our minds that these are sort of like a small group of sort of unhinged individuals who find each other. They end up, doing their things. But I think it's also important to talk about like where these people come from, how they end up, performing violence, how they end up doing these sort of things. And one of the deals that I always like to get into is there are a lot of people around this country who may not be members of Proud Boys or Oath Keepers or any of these other right wing groups who are already fantasizing about the type of activities that these people are engaged in. And one of the most dangerous parts, I think, about this moment is not just Republican and right wing rhetoric that is mainstream at this point, but how that makes the difference between who fantasizes about it and who participates in it. And right now we're in like this weird period where there are a lot of people who are like right on the verge of not just extremism but radical extremism.
No, I think that's right. And in addition to that, I think one of the things that is most challenging about kind of studying these groups and these movements is the fact that you can't really predict what individuals associated with this movement are going to take part in extremist violence, particularly kind of mass casualty type extremist violence. If you look at the history of extremist violence in this country, particularly, I think a good example is anti-abortion extremists and the people that have engaged in assassinations and even bombings of clinics. And for the most part, they were people that were on the fringes of the movement. They weren't leaders in the movement. They weren't very popular, weren't prominent voices within the movement. There are a few exceptions. I think his name is Timothy Gunn, who gunned down 3 or 4 people in Pensacola, Florida. I think this is in the early 90s. He killed a abortion provider and some nurses. And he was someone that was always present at the protest of the clinic. But that is not typical for what we've seen. And so I think when you think about like the amount of people that are marinating in this kind of extremist hate online, it's just really difficult to kind of figure out like who will get radicalized to the point that they'll take kind of real world violent action, and that's a real challenge that we have to. I don't know of a solution for how we can meet that moment.
Does that mean like you couldn't necessarily give us an answer as to like just how many people are in the far right in that general sense, or is that going to be too hard of a question or too hard of a number to come up with?
Wow. Well, that's I think yeah, that's I think you can come up with estimates on what number of people might be in particular groups or particular sectors of the movement. I think you can come up with an estimation of how many members of the Proud Boys there are. You can come up with estimations of how many members of, say, a white nationalist group like Patriot Front there are. Um, but as far as um, just how many people out there are, either adhere to or are sympathetic to far right extremist ideologies, I think that's really difficult to pin a number on. I would suggest that it's probably higher than most people would expect. I mean, I don't think we're talking about thousands of people. We'd be talking about hundreds of thousands of people, if not a few million people.
Wow. I was also going to ask you how far we talk about local politics, but how deeply penetrative is have the far right gotten into national politics, into Congress? This is the Marjorie Taylor Greene question, I suppose. But how do you think how deep has that gotten?
Well, I think one of the most concerning things for me isn't necessarily kind of the number of far right politicians that have been elected to Congress. And you can debate who you would categorize as a far right politician, whether it's somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Paul Gosar or others. But I think one of the concerning things that I've seen, and I think a lot of other extremist researchers have also seen, is kind of the infiltration of the far right within the Republican staff members of Congress. There are a significant amount of people that would call themselves groypers. Those are basically like fanboys of the anti-Semitic, white nationalist, neo-fascist Nick Fuentes. And so when you kind of understand just exactly kind of how how many of the people that are working for members of Congress that are probably um, adherents of really far right extremist ideologies, I think that's pretty concerning. I think when you look at like a group like the New York Young Republicans, which has essentially been kind of overtaken by far right fascist ideologues, that's really concerning too. So I think when you scratch the surface below just the people that are appearing on C-SPAN, that's when you see there is a real problem within the Republican Party.
Teddy, I got good news and bad news. I'm about to give you a thought experiment. You've just been named the anti-extremism czar that is going to absolutely clean this thing up and make everything work better. You're not even held back by the bureaucracy of things. What needs to be done, in your opinion, in order to clean up this mess? I think we can look at a few things, including internet moderation, making sure that these tech companies aren't spreading these things for profit. But what else do you see, like just sort of reverse engineering what you see in terms of like how people are being radicalized, these ideas are being spread, how this stuff is being cultivated? What needs to be done to start to clean up this mess?
Well, that's a really difficult question. I think there's a couple of things that I would be concerned about as far as exerting kind of power, the power of the state to try to fix this problem. I think there is there has been a lot of acceptance within kind of the progressive liberal community of using uh, federal law enforcement and other federal state agencies to attack violent extremism. And I think while there are some uses of that, that also presents some problematic issues. Um, and I think as far as content moderation and things like deplatforming people and organizations, I think that's a conversation worth having. I think it's a tool. So there's several tools that you can use, but I think one of the most useful things isn't probably kind of thinking about this from like what can the federal government do, what can law enforcement agencies do, what can social media platforms do. I think a lot of it amounts to what resources are we going to think about using as far as ensuring that people don't get radicalized in the first place?
Hmm.
I think, and this may dovetail into content moderation, but I think when you look at who are the people that are radicalized into extremist ideologies, particularly kind of when you talk about kind of white supremacists, white nationalists, and other extremist ideologies, it's almost entirely made up of young white men. And that's the same thing when you think about kind of who is radicalized into kind of the incel culture or who has been influenced by this so-called manosphere, right? There are a lot of um, young white men, although there's a lot of men of color that also get involved in the various aspects of this. But there's a real problem with kind of the amount of how easily, basically, like teenagers can get radicalized online. And so part of that might be content moderation, but I think part of it is education and kind of, and that that might take the form of numerous different things, from nonprofit organizations to faith-based groups to even local organizations, local community organizations working to ensure that people aren't radicalized in the first place. I think that's kind of, I think, might be the answer to ensure people um, don't spend 10 hours on YouTube and another 10 hours on Telegram every day getting radicalized by all these extremist ideologies. um, that's, as far as I'm concerned, that's kind of where the root of the problem is ensuring that people don't get radicalized in the first place.
I just want to say I don't have a confirmation vote, but you just got it. I think a lot of people want to use state power to go ahead and sort of squash this thing or add to it. But we already have, first of all, we already have all the power on the books necessary in order to make sure that like legitimate threats are taken care of. It just so happens that law enforcement doesn't actually believe that like extreme white people are the main problem in the country. They tend to go after people of color and immigrants. But on top of that, I think what you just said is important, which is we need to get at the root of why people are radicalized, which is to start looking at like what kind of conditions and mindsets lead to this. Right now, I mean, you brought Nick Fuentes. Nick Fuentes coming out on social media and being re-platformed or whatever, it's the equivalent in Ghostbusters of them opening the containment unit and just letting it go wild, right? I mean, it was starting to make a little bit of a difference, starting to moderate this type of stuff,
Mhm.
but like a lot of this is already out of the bottle.
And
And
if
go ahead.
I was just gonna say, and if you're someone that's like our age, if you're in your late 30s, early 40s, if you're part of the Generation X or even a millennial generation, you probably don't understand the appeal that someone like Nick Fuentes has. I mean, if you've ever watched his live streams and his videos, he doesn't come across as particularly charismatic to kind of our generation, but he is really speaking directly to young men that are currently in their teens and early 20s. I think it's really important to understand just how appealing voices like Nick Fuentes are to younger, particularly white men right now. He is really speaking their language, and I think that's really important to understand.
I was looking at when you're talking about education and trying to get kids to get them there before they are radicalized. Look at the reaction the right had to simple, educating kids on accepting of people. You know what I mean? Like, I can't picture any future in our country where we would be able to successfully implement a curriculum, that would help keep people from being radicalized based on the fact that they're burning books over the most simplest things even now.
Right, and I think one of the good kind of ways to understand that is when you look at the so-called parents' rights movement.
Mhm.
This kind of these right wing and far right activists that want to control various aspects of education. They're also the same movement that wants to believe that parents should have the right to homeschool their children without any interference from the government or any regulation. They believe that parents should have the right to not have their children vaccinated from any kind of disease or what have you. But they also believe that parents shouldn't have the right to take their kids to a pride event or take their kids to any kind of LGBT activity. It's very much the kind of school of thought that, um, the idea that the government and the legal system is meant to restrain certain people and not others, right? And so I think, but for a large swath of America, I think that they still find that kind of rhetoric maybe not appealing, but I think there's still a lot of fear around things that people don't understand, and there's a lot of people that are still motivated by fear of the LGBT IQ community, particularly the trans community, in part because they have been viciously targeted by the far right and right wing media over the last few years. So yeah, there's a whole lot of elements at play there.
Teddy Wilson, one of the best researchers of extremism for my money. Radical Reports is the Substack. The Insurrectionist Cookbook is the podcast. I can't recommend them highly enough. Teddy, tell the good people where to find you.
Yeah, you can find me on Substack if you go to radicalreports.org, where I publish several times a week. And then you can find the podcast at Patreon/Insurrectionist Cookbook. It's available wherever you get your podcast, whether it's Apple Podcast or Spotify or SoundCloud.
Teddy, thanks so much for joining us.
Of course.
All right, that was Teddy Wilson, friend of the pod, extremism researcher. Again, the Substack is Radical Reports. The podcast is Insurrectionist Cookbook. It was really good getting to talk with Teddy and getting an idea where the pulse is. I agree with him, Nick. I think that this is an incubation period. I think we're still under a lot of threats, and we'll see where things go. I was going to ask you, and we didn't get a chance to talk with Teddy about this. I mentioned on a weekender, I want to say it was either last week or maybe the week before, that leading up to 9/11, there was sort of this angst about a major attack on America. Not that people were predicting it or that it was being planned, but there was a cultural sort of a feeling. We talked about the Olympics sort of has a shadow over it, the idea of like terrorism, possibly. I think even some extremists have been sort of putting out propaganda about an attack on the Olympics. Doesn't it feel a little bit like something is in the air, that something big and bad is sort of like coming down the line? I mean, I'm not predicting that, but doesn't it feel culturally a little bit like that's in the air a little?
I mean, yeah. I think that since 9/11, since these attacks, like it's probably always in your mind, even when you go to like the mall,
Yeah.
which is really that's why the terrorists win, is because they've changed the mindset of people. Now, like for instance, I was in Buenos Aires coaching a Maccabi team, which is related to Israel, and they arrested 3 guys who were about to do some terrible terrorist attack at the games. So I just haven't gone through that. Yeah, it's definitely on my mind. I was trying to think about if I could somehow get attached to the Team USA basketball team and maybe help them do something. And I was like, that would be amazing, be an incredible experience. But there also would be in the back of my mind, the notion that could happen. And heck, I'm supposed to go to Israel next year for to coach more, and I'm severely worried about that and have no idea if it's even going to happen.
And I just want to point out, based on what we were talking about with the momentum that's taking place in Europe and everything else, and the far right and the way that they work with extremists basically, and fighting this sort of like feedback loop, we need to be aware that like if anything like that occurs, like that does change things in a hurry.
Mhm.
And we need to be aware that a lot of the energies that are sort of percolating in the United States and around the world, they're like completely and utterly manipulatable. And I mean, a spark could set them off. And I just hope for all of us that like we can stay away from that. We can start to deal with authoritarianism and maybe start to turn the temperature down a little bit.
Please.
Please. All right, everybody. We will be back again with a live show Thursday night, June 13th. That's going to be at 8 p.m. Eastern. All you got to do is go over to patreon.com/muckrake-podcast, subscribe, support the show, keep us rolling, keep us growing, and come hang out with us. We'll chat, we'll talk, we'll take your questions. Looking forward to it. Until then, you can find Nick at Can You Hear Me SMH. You can find me at J. West Sexton. Be safe.